The third branch of government, the United States Supreme Court, was created in part to ensure that the other two branches didn't allow politics to impact the nation. Now, that principle is being tested as the court weighs in on issues from immigration and voting rights to student debt and censorship on the internet. Today, we hear from well-known author, journalist, and television host Juan Williams, a mainstay in American media who literally wrote the book on one of the court's most famous jurists, whose career fundamentally changed the nation. From Ballard Studios, it's 13th and Park.
The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted.
There is not a liberal America and a conservative America. There is the United States of America.
We will make America strong again. We will get through this together.
I can hear you. The rest of the world hears you. And the people who knock these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
Juan, welcome to the show. Justin and I are thrilled to have you on, but I want you to know up front that as much as you co-hosted The Five for so many, many years, we like to consider ourselves, for today's purposes, the three. It's going to be you, Justin, and me. So the three versus the five. I think we'll try to hold the other two positions if we can.
I don't think we'll have much trouble.
Justin, take it away.
Sure, Juan. Thrilled to have you with us. One of the things we want to talk to you about is the current United States Supreme Court. It got a lot of attention the last few years with some of their decisions. Obviously, the balance of the court is decidedly more conservative than it's been in many years. What is your feeling about the public perception of the Supreme Court now, where it stands, and how that affects and should it affect the legitimacy of the court?
You asked what I think, Justin, but I think that, it's as a baseline, let's start with what we know about public perception.
Mm-hmm.
And what public perception indicates in Gallup polling is now a majority of Americans disapprove of this Supreme Court. And there's a reason for that. They think that it's more political than ever. And why do I say they think it's more political? Because, you stop and look at something like the Roe v. Wade decision to overturn abortion rights as a constitutional matter in this country. It's overwhelming that Americans think that that should not have been done by the high court. When I say overwhelming, I am trying to indicate implicitly that Republicans think that decision should not have been overturned. But we live in an age where I think you can say the Supreme Court is the epitome of tyranny by the minority. Why do I say that? Because you have one president, President Trump, who had three nominations to the court, people seated on the court by President Trump. I think that's the most appointed by any president, if I'm trying to get this straight, but I think that's the most appointed by any president to serve one term in the last 100 years. And of course, you have at the moment 6 of the justices who are nominated by Republicans. Mitch McConnell, the Senate leader, the Republican leader in the Senate, lots of credit one way or another. He held off, for example, when Obama had a nomination towards the end of his term, said, we don't do that. But when it was a matter for Donald Trump, here came Amy Coney Barrett. And he said, yes, and sure enough, she's on the court. Steps like this encourage the American people to see this as a political institution. And, when I said it's a tyranny of the minority, Justin, I say that because from the larger political perspectives, think about this for a second. I think it's the case that right now, Democrats have won 7 of the last 9 presidential elections, but Republicans have held the presidency in 4 of those 5 elections and have a disproportionate share, the 6 members of the high court. So for people who are thinking, well, gee, wait a second, there are more Democrats in the country than Republicans, or people who are thinking, what about abortion rights? Or why is it that the Congress had to act on gay marriage out of fear of the court? I think the conclusion is this is a partisan institution now. No longer is it a nation of laws ruled by a court acting beyond any personal bias, but in fact, it is rooted at the moment in partisan views of one party, the Republican Party.
When you look for the point at which maybe the court started to get more of a reputation for being politicized, it certainly has to be, you have to go back to the recount and the fact that the United States Supreme Court was the final arbiter of the presidency of the United States, without exaggeration, back in 2000. Then moving forward, when Roberts, now Chief Justice Roberts, came onto the court, he was very aware of the increasing perception of politicization and tried, I think, as much as possible to fight that, to push back against that. But can he and will he, as we start to move forward with a court that clearly, as you suggest, has a very different composition than it did a couple of years ago?
Well, what comes to my mind as we're talking about this, Adam, is Chief Justice Roberts once said, in trying to knock down some of the critics, he said, there's no such thing as an Obama judge. Mm-hmm. We're just judges, federal judges, and our job is to look at the law and not to consider the political origins or perspectives that either bring a case to the court or would be the reaction from a decision to those cases coming to the court. But in fact, I think we'd be fools not to look at the 6-member majority up there right now and say 3 of them are Trump judges.
Should it matter whether any decision of the court is politically popular? We could go back in history and look at a lot of decisions of the court, and should the justices of the Supreme Court look at polling as they make their decisions as to what is constitutional and what is not constitutional? How much should that be a factor in their consideration?
I don't think it should be a factor if we lived in an ideal world. Because as I said earlier, when you look at the establishment of the court, the idea was that it would be there to simply affirm without bias what is constitutional, what is valid under American law, and that we are a nation of laws. So it would stop the executive branch and the legislative branch from exceeding their roles in governing. But here's the thing, you don't want a court that is somehow out of touch with American life. Some of these cases are literally born not of lower courts saying we have a problem here, but of partisan organizations pushing cases, sometimes pushing them through judge shopping to find somebody so that they can elevate the case to the court in the hope that the court will then address their partisan political concern. Again, that is what is going on right now. And if you don't understand what to me is extra legal maneuvering to force the court into a position, then I think that you are, sort of closing your eyes to the reality of what's become a very partisan institution.
Well, let's go back in history a little bit. And this, of course, is your history as well, Juan, when you penned the quintessential book on former Chief Justice Thurgood Marshall. And I read a good part of that book. That's what Haverfordians do. Just for disclosure, both having come from Haverford College, we actually read. And I remember how you basically made the point, whereas Martin Luther King, was a transcendent figure in the movement, and Malcolm X got a lot of attention also for all sorts of other reasons. It was Thurgood Marshall that actually created a legacy in defending individual freedoms that lives to this day. You might say being challenged to this day, but lives to this day. Tell me what it was like interviewing Thurgood Marshall when you did this book. I think you did it for months on end. What was it like? And what do you remember most from that conversation? And did it make you feel more confident that the third branch of government was in good hands?
Oh, gosh, so this is a trip down memory lane for me, Adam. When you ask what was it like to interview Thurgood Marshall, he's an iconic figure. I don't think you have to say who he is when you're discussing American life with historians, with even average people. They know that Thurgood Marshall was the first African American on the Supreme Court. They know that he was involved in Brown v. Board of Education, arguably the landmark decision of the Supreme Court in the 20th century. And they understand that, I'm not sure this is well known, but I think among lawyers it's well known that when he went on the court, he was literally the Babe Ruth, Hank Aaron of Supreme Court lawyers, because he had won more cases arguing before the court than any other lawyer in American history. So a truly iconic figure in American life. The book's title is Thurgood Marshall, but the subtitle is American Revolutionary, because I think his legal work really fomented a revolution in the way that we live life as Americans. And I say that not only because I'm a Black American, but I say that because I'm a member of the press. And if you look even now, arguments about Times v. Sullivan and et cetera, there's Thurgood Marshall really exerting tremendous pressure to protect the rights of reporters. If you look at Roe v. Wade, if you look at affirmative action and, the seminal affirmative action cases dealing with higher education, as well as dealing with business, contracting, and the like, there's Thurgood Marshall. Mm-hmm. You think about prisoner rights. Fortunately, none of us, Justin, you or me, are in that issue. But again, prisoner rights, there's Thurgood Marshall. So, he's sort of a leading voice in all these very critical arenas of American life as we live it today in the 21st century. So when you ask me, what was it like to interview him? I think what stands out is that he didn't want to do an interview with me. I don't think I'm being offensive in saying he was a grumpy old guy at times, right? One of my favorite stories about interviewing him is I would go up to the chambers at the Supreme Court. I did this weekly for 6 months, and usually around lunchtime. And I noticed every day he's having chicken noodle soup. And, his aide would bring in the platter with the soup from the cafeteria. And so finally, one day I worked up the gumption, I'm going to say something. I said, why do you have chicken soup you can have anything you want. And he didn't talk. He just was silent again. I thought, oh, gee, I tripped over myself here. What did I do to, is he going to kick me out? And then he says, young man, I want you to know Campbell's chicken soup is a reliable product. Don't forget it. Okay. So, for an old man, that's kind of, that's his thing. He's going to I know my chicken soup is good soup. I don't care what you have to say about me eating it every day.
What Campbell Soup would not do today to put that on the air.
I'm telling you. The other thing about it is, you go into his chambers and, you go past all these brilliant law clerks, and some of them obviously are on the court now. But you go into his chambers, and there on the desk was a bust of Frederick Douglass. There on the wall was a copy of the Brown decision signed by John W. Davis, who was his opponent in the case. And also on the wall is a skin given to him by the president of Kenya. And the reason is, maybe people don't know this, but when Kenya gained its independence from Great Britain, they had to write a constitution. And they asked Thurgood Marshall, an American, to come to Kenya to help write their constitution. And that was his payment, the skin. So this is, to me, it was like, wow, holy moly, where am I, right? The thing about it is, as I say, he was not one to seek publicity, just not that at all. And it strikes me, I remember talking with Justice Scalia about him, and Scalia saying, none of us in the conference had ever represented someone on death row. But Thurgood had. And, Marshall himself used to tell me about, protecting women who were involved with back alley abortions. And I was thinking, this is kind of nitty-gritty American life that this guy has lived through. Stories like standing on a railroad platform in the South and the sheriff driving by and say, this is sundown town. meaning no blacks are allowed here after sundown. Again, you just think, wow, he's had quite a life. He lived in every decade of the 20th century. And I think he changed America. So for me, it was intimidating to talk with him. At the same time, thinking, I wish he hadn't been maybe as old or as grumpy, that he was more forthcoming. But I think if you look at the book, you'll see he was sufficiently forthcoming to make for a great book, in my opinion, as the author.
We have a clip from a interview that you gave to C-SPAN about your book, Eyes on the Prize. We're going to play that, and then we'll come back after the clip and ask you a question.
Okay.
This is the book we're going to be talking about today, Eyes on the Prize, America's Civil Rights Years 54 through 65. Juan Williams, our guest, wrote the book, and it is a companion book to a 6-part PBS series. Was it a unique experience preparing for this book?
It really was, and I realized that over half of the country now was born after this period. This is not distant history. It's not distant that Rosa Parks had to put her dime in the front of the bus, get off, and then walk to the back door and get in the back. That sort of strict segregation and legally enforced segregation is recent in our country's history and still has impact on blacks and whites.
So Juan, obviously that interview was a few years ago. And
you can tell by my hair.
Who is that handsome guy we were just looking at? Yes.
I don't know. I tell you, it's hard. I the other day I was thinking, I have a 43-year-old son. I was like, wow, holy smokes.
Well, it was interesting, the observation you made there about at that time of that interview, half the population was born after that. And now here we are so many years later, 2023. How would you assess the state of civil rights in America today, 2023? We had 8 years of an African-American president, which was obviously unprecedented and historic, both his election and his reelection. And so how would you assess the state of civil rights in the United States today with respect to African-Americans?
Wow. So, Justin, I think I would start where we have been in terms of talking about the Supreme Court, the High Court of the United States, and saying it's quite telling that it was the Supreme Court that undid the Voting Rights Act for the large part, doing away with the kind of scrutiny of states that previously had imposed or maybe undue restrictions on Black voting rights in this country, and said, you will be subject to federal review for any changes that you make in voting procedures, organizing, registration, and the like. And then you think, well, but the Supreme Court said that's unfair because, we seem to have made progress in this regard and there were no reports. And yet now, here we are in 2023 and in 2022, as well as in 2020, large fights over voter registration, access to voting booths, the rules for allowing where voting booths will be located. It's still there and a big argument in American life. Some people say it's not an issue. Others say it is an issue. If you go talk to Stacey Abrams down in Georgia, she'd say it's an issue. But recently people have pointed out, say, well, most voters in Georgia didn't, especially Black voters, didn't say that. So I'll leave it up to you to make a decision. But I don't think there's any question. There's some controversy about the ability of Blacks, but especially poor Blacks, to get to the polls to this day in 2023. The larger answer to your question, though, I think speaks to, issues like poverty and issues like education. And that then leads you into childhood poverty. And the numbers are just distressing when you look at poverty rates among Blacks as compared to the rest of the population, much higher. If you look at levels of educational attainment, graduation rates, and the like, again, sort of depressing to see what's going on, especially with Black boys. And then if you look at unemployment, it's still the case, even with low unemployment nationwide, that Black unemployment is still twice the rate of white unemployment. So that's all part of the picture. But the biggest point that I would mention to you would be what's been going on in terms of police violence, brutality, going back to the George Floyd case. But even before that, if you think of Trayvon Martin, who was shot by a security guard, you see that these incidents then led to what I think of in my mind as a new phase of civil rights movement in America, best represented by the phrase Black Lives Matter. And what that suggests, contrary to Donald Trump, who said, oh, that's a discriminatory term because all lives matter. What that suggests is Black people saying our lives matter, to each other, Black Lives Matter, and trying to just affirm, that people may say, oh, I see Blacks as a greater threat in terms of criminality, or they look at the high incarceration rates, et cetera. You can look at that and say, oh, it's something bad about Black people, and they don't matter. And here is an affirmation of the idea that I think, again, coming from Black people, that our lives matter. And you think, why do you need to make such an assertion in the year 2023? And again, I think it speaks to the ongoing racial issues in American life.
You said both Black Lives Matter, and then you followed up by saying our lives matter. As a public relations media person in politics, when you say our lives matter, I think that sounds very inclusive of everybody.
Yeah, it is.
I want to go to kind of a different place with you. I know a lot about your background from Haverford College on. I know that you came from Panama to Brooklyn to Oakwood, which is a wonderful Quaker institution.
That's very nice of you. That's my favorite. I love that school.
I could tell. I did some checking up on you in Oakwood and some of the things that you've done there and some of the things you've spoken to there. But what you and I understand, Juan, is that both Oakwood and Haverford College preach a kind of approach and philosophy of life, which led you, I think, to what you might call middleism, like to the center. That this is kind of to the core of who you really are at a time when the country is not, at least not perceptionally. How do you think that background really kind of propelled you to do what you did, both in your career and in your views, Juan, about the world around us?
Wow, I don't want to just jump to an answer, Adam, but what you didn't say about both institutions is that both are Quaker institutions. And the Quakers have a saying, there's that of God in each and every one of us, that of God in every child. And the Quakers were important in part of the abolition movement. I think early on made a statement about including Black children in schools. So that was just so critical for me coming from, as an immigrant. I came to this country when I was 4 years old. Brooklyn can be a little tough, poor kid. And, it's just a real salvation that Oakwood School took me in. And then my sister went to Swarthmore, another institution with Quaker roots. And my brother was a Haverfordian, so he went to Haverford as well. So all of that is very important. And I think if you think about Quaker values, and at Haverford, we all abide by that famous covenant that says, we have an understanding about the rules, and we each take it on ourselves that we are going to behave and hold each other accountable for how we behave in this way. So I am not to the far right or far left. I am in the middle, and I am just part of the Oakwood Haverford experience. For me is a strong sense of believing in community and the obligations each and every one of us has to each other as part of a working community that acknowledges us as God's children, but also that gives us respect, opportunity, and maybe most of all, gives us some sense of confidence that we're looking out for each other. So I don't think that I have all the knowledge and I have the wisdom unto myself, but I do want to hear from others, talk to others, share perspectives with others. That's who I am. And I think that that's pretty fortunate that I'm a journalist, because I get to talk to lots of people. Yeah.
With respect to the middle of America, are people who consider themselves not partisans on either side. And one of the explanations you'll hear sometimes is it has to do with the news media, how people get their information in the age of the internet, and how that's changing. One thing that concerns me personally is, I believe it was Pew or one of the other Gallup polling institutions did a poll, and they asked Americans, what's your level of trust in the American news media? And over time, over the last 50 years, that level of trust continues to get lower and lower. And my concern with that is, if there are no trusted institutions, or if the people who trust in the traditional news sources get lower and lower, that opens up a market for other people to get into the news business, not other people, everyone to get into the news business. And I want to put that in air quotes. And then really everyone can live in their own version of reality. So I guess my question to you is, does that concern you? And do you think it's already a foregone conclusion that those news media institutions that practice journalism the way it's taught in some of the finest journalism schools, Columbia, Northwestern, et cetera, is it too late for some of those formerly preeminent news organizations to ever restore that trust that they used to have by the American people in their news reporting?
Justin, that's such a hot topic at the moment. The whole notion of objectivity is being challenged at this moment at the highest levels of journalism, people arguing about it. But the trust issue that you highlighted, Justin, is exactly right, that you can just look at the numbers and you can see a decline, a deterioration in public trust of American media. I like to joke with people that, you talk about lack of trust, journalists are below the morticians and the used car dealers at this point.
Right.
And I think that some of this comes from the attacks on media. Again, we come back to Trump, fake news. That's his invention, right? Fake news. Don't believe anything I don't tell you. What they're telling you is all fake. Then you have the whole notion of economic models that reward partisan presentation of news. So what people do, and I think all of us as Americans hold some responsibility here, but we tend now to go to sources of news that affirm pre-existing opinions, that tell Justin that Justin is right and that Juan and Adam are wrong. So Justin goes to his preferred source of information, and that's what gets the ratings and what makes the money. And you see more of that kind of partisan media organization grow. But don't forget, then Justin and Juan have something to say about what Justin is doing. And they say, Justin, your media organization is not to be trusted. And suddenly you see people saying, I don't trust the media, and I get a big kick out of people who say they do their own research. And I say, well, you do your own research? Really? You have all that time and access and resources to do it? And they say, I go on the internet. My God, you go on the internet. That to me is like a sewer. I mean, you can't trust that information. They have no way to know if they are being lied, spun, exposed to conspiracies. It's still a shock to me, how many people believe in QAnon. But they do. Mm-hmm. And so you have to understand there's a percentage of Americans, a cohort, that if you are dealing with them as your fellow Americans, that's in their mind. That's their perception, And in this town, we had a guy come and try to shoot up a pizza parlor because he thought Democrats were, selling children and drinking their blood. I mean, it's bizarre. But so the internet does not encourage trust in American media. And here's the one last point I'd make on this. And this, because I'm an old man, I'm 68 years old, soon to be 69. It is an absolute shock to me when people say to me, the number one source of news in America is not the New York Times, the Washington Post, NPR, Fox. No, number one source is Facebook.
Right.
And the other day, someone said it wasn't even Facebook, it was TikTok. Mm-hmm. The young people who are on TikTok spend 90 minutes a day there, and that's where they're getting their news. I was like, are you kidding me? Who would believe this stuff, right? Is that real?
Wow.
But it's real.
So, first of all, Juan, just for the record, I think that the ratings on Justin's network that would say you and I are wrong are very low. I just want to get that out there.
All right, Justin, you heard it.
All right. Absolutely.
I don't know where that could possibly exist, but it's very interesting you talk about TikTok. And obviously there's now renewed focus on, it's a Chinese-owned tech company, and there's a lot of pressure. The Biden administration is now moving towards a possible ban. I've even heard the word ban in this country. What do you think of that particular case? And then at the end of this, I want you to also comment on this one question, what would you tell a journalism student about how to get it done and get it done nobly and well in the environment we now live in?
Well, part of the thing about TikTok, Adam, is not what Justin and I were discussing about, low trust and even whether or not they are trustworthy. That's about, whether or not they are sharing data on all of us or all of their subscribers with the Chinese government, allowing a form of spying really to take place so that China has the ability to spread propaganda, to disinformation, misinformation, and the like that would influence life in this country. And even, I think on a troubling level, to discourage children from studying and going to Haverford, So that, I think that's a larger topic there, but maybe bet when you guys have a CIA agent on or something like that. But I think when you asked about what I would say to young people, this is a really intriguing question for me because, sometimes I get asked to come to a school and talk to the journalism students. And what I've experienced is now we've gone from the model where people want to be Woodward and Bernstein to a model where they want to be rich and famous anchors. They want to be the host of prime time cable network programs because that's where the money is. I'm like, wow, don't you want to go out and do reporting? Don't you want to speak truth to power and how democracy works, how power works, expose the bad guys, and reward and celebrate the good in this? No, they see it as a career. It's about the money. To me, this is disappointing, but at this point, it's pretty clear that's what's going on. I just don't run into too many people anymore who want to spend a couple of years digging into like poverty or digging into, the roots of the opioid epidemic. So, thank God there's still some people around who will get the job done. But I don't have a great deal of reason to think, there's a next generation coming along that's willing to do the really grunt work. And also, there are fewer local newspapers where you can go as a young person and, you might scrape by financially, but you get to cover the local school board or city council. You get to understand how the deal works. You expose corruption at that level. There are fewer newspapers or TV stations involved in that business who hire local reporters anymore. So you can't just say to the students, you guys are silly to be thinking about the money. They can't make a living doing it in some cases. When I was at Haverford, the Philadelphia Evening Bulletin hired an intern, me. And, I got to be right there and I got to see what went on with Frank Rizzo in City Hall and his brother at the fire department. That's an eye opener.
Mm-hmm. For the record, I did work with Frank Rizzo in one of his election campaigns. You talk about guys and dolls. Wow. And that was guys and dolls in reality, right? Not very Haverfordian, maybe. Well, Juan, we really appreciate you taking all the time today to be with us. You are an incredibly important piece of the national conversation. You do want and seek truth and balance. And with your Quaker background and roots, you do that for a reason that goes beyond the here and now and here on earth, as they say. And I applaud you for all that you did. Some of what you've done, I know, has taken great courage as well as dedication in your journalism. And, America is a lot better off because of it.
Well, Justin, Adam, thank you both for having me. It's been a good conversation, so I appreciate the opportunity, the platform, and good luck to you both.
I have an announcement. This is my last day hosting The Five. The show's popularity has grown every single year. So thank you. Thank you so much to you, the viewers. Thank you.
Wait, Juan, that's not going to be it.
Yes.
That's not going to be it. We got a little something for you. Watch, everyone.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Juan Williams. Hello, everyone. I'm Juan Williams. Hello, everyone. I'm Juan Williams. It's 5 o'clock in New York City. This is The Five.
Well, Adam, that was quite a conversation. We covered a lot of ground. Juan is very, very thoughtful. I disagree with him on a few things that he had to say about the Supreme Court, and I actually pressed him on it. And he answered the question the right way, which is, I said on the Supreme Court, I said, well, how much should justices of the Supreme Court take into consideration polls? Should they be looking at polls as they issue their decisions? And ultimately, he said no, and which is the right answer. That would be even worse. That would even politicize the court even more than it's perceived to be politicized now. But that's really the central dilemma. It's easy to look at a poll and say a majority of Americans don't approve of the Supreme Court, but really, what's the solution? Is the solution for them to look at the polls? Well, no, that's not the solution. I think what people want is they want the court to decide cases based on the law, and Juan agreed with that principle. But I think it's a real conundrum for the court as to how they proceed going forward in terms of to what extent they should consider the fact that they may not be approved of by a majority of the American people.
Well, it's interesting. Juan made the point that a lot of the cases being brought before the court are highly politicized. Whether they started out that way or not, they get embroiled in the political, fight. And then what do the justices do? I mean, there was a reason the founding fathers wanted a third branch of government, and it was really to try to tame any potential excess leading towards politicization or self-serving or private agendas. There was a reason. It was part of the checks and balances, right? But he's saying that when these cases come at the court and they're already highly charged, right? You talk about Title 42 and student debt relief and the most recent cases about censorship on the internet, affirmative action, voting rights. I mean, these are not easy layups, right?
Right.
And they come to the court hot and they're already full of politics and ardor. What do you do?
Right. And that was the point that I was making, is that they have to decide these questions, these very divisive questions, and in a way that sometimes a president or a Congress doesn't have to. Sometimes those elected officials, they stay away from those fights, or those fights become very partisan. So unfortunately for the court, they're being put into the middle of a lot of these very highly polarized debates. I think the other question that was interesting that I asked him about was the state of civil rights in America today. We saw the clip of Rosa Parks. Obviously, we don't have that type of official government-sanctioned explicit racial discrimination as we once had in that sense. Now you have people challenging affirmative action in university systems as being a form of racism. The Supreme Court's going to have to decide on that. But the issues that he discussed, he talked about voting rights and talked about some of the restrictions there. From my perspective, I think the issues that he talked about later were more in tune with kind of what some of the what I would consider the more modern civil rights issues, which is public safety and education. The inequality in the educational system, to me, is one of the top, if not the top, civil rights issue of our era in terms of disparities between the education received by people depending on students, depending on where you live and what color your skin is and what your ethnic background is. That's one. And then also safety. We saw in Chicago, the incumbent mayor lose her reelection. A lot of it had to do with the public safety issue. Yep. People don't feel safe. And it wasn't because the police department of Chicago was acting inappropriately towards people. It was because of the high number of deaths and homicides in that community. So those are issues I think that if we polled, those issues would score a lot higher amongst African-American voters than issues like, whether they allow the voting to stay open until 4 p.m. for early voting as opposed to 6 p.m. for early voting on the Sunday before the election. So
he talked about his interviews with Thurgood Marshall. And for anyone listening to this who is not thoroughly, invested in understanding what Thurgood Marshall brought to the court, not just in terms of breaking the color line and making history, but in terms of how he stood tall for individual rights, whether you agree with all the ways he did it or not, even in today's light, it was amazing. And the fact that you could tell from Juan, there was a sense, he was a much younger Juan then, no offense, Juan, that there was a sense of awe, talking to this jurist. This was, after his years of service, talking to this jurist about what it was like to even just be a Black lawyer in America at that point, much less one on the rise. And he did it, by the way, must reading. This is a book that everyone should read. First of all, it's penned remarkably well. I mean, Juan must have been an A+ English major at Haverford because it was written beautifully. It really also gives you a sense of context for where we are now, Justin.
Right. And it really does put that in context from the Thurgood Marshall era, from the desegregation of schools court case, Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, until he completed his service on the U.S. Supreme Court, and, where we stand today to have had an African-American president elected and reelected. A lot of those achievements were made possible because of Thurgood Marshall's advocacy. And it was interesting to hear about the story of Kenya that he shared with us.
Right, exactly.
That he was so respected around the world that even other nations looked to him for that guidance. And I didn't go to Haverford. I wasn't fortunate enough to go to Haverford, but I was fortunate enough to get admitted into Georgetown, and I went to school there. And my senior year, I took a class in constitutional law. And one of the assignments for our constitutional law class was to go witness arguments at the Supreme Court of the United States. And honestly, I will never forget doing that because I remember seeing Thurgood Marshall take the bench. We were there when they kind of took the bench, and I don't remember who else was on the court at that time. Rehnquist was the Chief Justice, but I remember being awed in that moment at Thurgood Marshall's presence and being able to witness him in a Supreme Court case.
There's some talk today, and it's bipartisan, by the way, coming from, I believe it's Senators Durbin and Grassley, Democrat, Republican, obviously, conversely, about televising the court proceedings. I think that if the American people could actually see the Supreme Court in session where a case is being pled by some of the brightest minds in America, and that the questions coming from the jurists are some of the brightest questions that you could ask legally, I think that would not only be fascinating as a civic lesson, but also I think actually may give Americans a shot in the arm, that there is a sense of concrete stability that the court represents, that once they witness, they'll say, oh my God, I had no idea. This isn't a shouting match. This isn't everyone to their own corners. Everyone is driving to get to a truth that is very, very complex often and very, very difficult to understand for many, and yet has such ramifications.
Adam, I wish I could agree with you on that one, but I'm a little bit more skeptical, and it really has to do with the last thing we talked about with Juan was the current internet media environment and people getting their news from Facebook and TikTok. And I would agree with you if people were required to watch the arguments in their entireties. But I think with anyone who's been on these social media sites knows that you can't really hold people's attention for very long on video format. So my fear is what will happen is those arguments will get sliced and diced up into 8 seconds, 10 seconds, and then get distributed. And then the arguments, or people's perception of the argument, will be reduced to a 10-second clip on TikTok. And I don't know that would further deepen the understanding of the court and how it works, or if it would diminish it or create a misperception of how the court operates. So I don't know. I wish that people could be required to watch the arguments in their entireties and not just consume them in little bites on TikTok and Facebook and Instagram and other social media. But I thought Juan's observations on the whole media environment were spot on. But I guess the question is, what's the way out of it, if there is a way out of it? And that's what I was hoping to hear, but I don't think that there necessarily is. I think, unfortunately, we're in this era of internet information.
It's frustrating. And listening to his answer, and he's trying to give you a solution, but I don't think anyone I've ever heard has come up with the elements of that solution. I think we, in a way, might have to muddle through where we are to get to a different place. But wherever that takes us, you got to be hopeful that people like Juan are in play.
Great to be able to interview him and to get his thoughts on a lot of these really interesting topics.
Don't miss future episodes by following us on Apple, Spotify, or other podcast platforms, or go to the YouTube channel where you can subscribe for free.